Hey guys, thanks for joining me again as we continue working on our account application in Go. Last time we discussed the application architecture and began building out models, errors, and interfaces inside of the model package. Today, we'll create our first handler for an endpoint called me, which a logged in user will be able to access to get their personal information. We'll unit test this handler by mocking the user service it interacts with. As always, you can check out the branch from the previous tutorial to sync up with the starting point of today's tutorial. Alright, we're back inside of the code editor. Before working on the me handler, I want to make a couple of changes. The first change is to move our errors into a separate subpackage called app errors. So let's create a folder called app errors and a file of the same name. And then let's copy all of the contents of this and just move it into app errors, and remembering to change the name of the package also to app errors. We save that, and then let's delete the original errors file since we no longer need it. The other thing I wanted to do is add a Go context interface to the user service and user repository methods as follows. So let's go inside of interfaces and let's add a parameter called ctx of type context.context, and as I mentioned, this will be automatically imported from the standard library. Let's also add that to the user repository. And that's all for the changes. I didn't do this when I originally built the application, but I thought it would be a nice addition which allows us to create a deadline by which the whole request or call chain must complete. So if we have any code, database access, or even cloud service access holding up our application, we can cancel the context and send a response indicating a deadline has been exceeded. We'll deal with setting this timeout and how to properly send a response in a later video, as it's not super easy. Recall that this handler layer needs access to the service layer, so let's give it access by adding the user interface into the handler definition. We'll do that like so. And the type is model.userService. Good. Now remember, we also have this new handler function which takes a config which instantiates the actual object handler. So we need to add the user service as well to the config and to the handler instantiation inside of new handler. Maybe I could have just copied that, but looks good. And then inside of this handler, let's instantiate it. So user service, and then we add a colon because we're actually instantiating, and we get that from the config. And add that trailing comma and go. Let's now write the code for the me handler. Since we'll be adding a decent amount of code to this handler method, I want to move it to its own file. So the original handler method is also in this handler.go file. Let's cut that me handler from the handler file and add a new file called me.go. And paste. And remember that in each file we have to give the package name, which here is handler, not model. And we save and do our imports. Next, let's add the code for this handler, and then I'll explain what's going on. So I'm going to replace this simple return of hello, it's me JSON with the actual code we'll end up testing. All right. So the first thing we'll need to do in this handler is check if we have a user on the context. We do this by using the convenience method get on the gen context C. In the actual application, the user will be extracted inside of some middleware and set on the gen context C. But for testing this handler as a unit, we'll have to sort of mock this in the tests. You'll also notice that we have this exists parameter and that we're checking here if the user key does not exist. Frankly, this should not happen, as our middleware should send an authorization error response before this method is called in the case there is no user. However, we'll be cautious and handle the case where the key doesn't exist and send an error response of a new internal server error, like so. And you notice that we'll send the errors on an error key inside of a JSON helper. Next, if the user is properly added onto a key and we have the user, we can extract the user and its ID by casting the user to our model.user and getting the ID. We then will take this ID and pass it to our user service's get method. Remember that we just injected this user service into our handler, which is why we can access it with h.userService. If an error is returned, we'll log the full details of this error to whatever logger we end up deciding to use. As far as sending a response to the end user in this case, we're just going to access our app errors and send a new not found error with the user ID cast as a string. And again, as is the case with all our errors, we'll send this as JSON on an error key, and then we'll return from this entire method. However, if we do successfully get a user from the user service, we'll return the user on the key user inside of JSON. And of course, take note of the HTTP statuses here. In this case, status OK is a 200. And in this case, we're going to get the status from the error using the error utility methods that we defined inside of apperrors.go. And you can see that in the previous tutorial. Now it's time to move on to testing. And to be able to do that, I'd like to add a new package called Testify. To add the package Testify, let's go to our console and go get the GitHub library Testify like so. All right, looks like we've added it, or updated in my case. I must have already installed it. So you may be asking, what is the purpose of this Testify package? Looking here at userservice.get, notice that we called the method, but we don't actually have any implementation of the user service, at least not as yet. Testify will allow us to create a so-called mock implementation of this service. This will allow us to write tests, and inside of these tests, to say what happens when we call userservice.get. So to be able to do that, let's create a Mox package inside of the model folder and define a mock for our user service. Let's do that like so. So in model, let's create a folder called Mox. And then the Mox will give each file a name for the service or repository that we're mocking. So we'll call this userservice.go. So I'm going to add the code for this mock and then do my best to explain what's going on. All right, I've added the code for the mocks and imported all of the necessary dependencies. So first, we create a mock user service and add mock.mock from the Testify package, which will give us access to methods that are part of the Testify package. Next, we create a get method with the function or method signature of the get method in the user service interface definition. Recall that the user service interface currently only has a single get method, so we currently only need this single get method to create or implement the user service. Inside of get, we use the methods on M defined by the Testify package to record what happens when calls are made to get from the test. Now, inside of the actual test, we can create an instance of the mock user service and write code thanks to this Testify package, which basically says, when we call get with a particular context and user ID, return such and such values for model.user and error. Now the m.called method here tracks the calls to this method with particular parameter combinations for context and user ID. We then typecast the method responses to model.user here and model.error here. We also take care of the case when either of the responses is nil. Therefore, we have these checks to see if they're nil. So we'll return nil and an error, or in the case of the first return parameter, we'll return a model.user reference or an error. All right, so let's get around to writing our first unit tests, and we'll do this inside of the handler folder by creating a me_test.go file, and the underscore test is the standard Go convention for creating a test file. Inside of the me_test.go file, I'm going to add the tests that I've written and then explain what's going on here. All right, we successfully added the code. So inside of this file, we have 3 test cases. So we create a single outer function called test_me, and then 3 cases using Go's testing package, t.run method. So the first case we want to test is success. So that's when we get a user response. The second case we want to test is when there is no user on the context. Remember, I went over that context key and said we should always have a user, but in case we don't, let's throw an internal error. So we want to test to make sure that works. And last, we want to test for when there is not a user found when we call the user service. So let's go over these 3 test cases by going back up to the success case here. So inside of this success case, the first thing we're going to do is just create a random user ID from the UUID new random method. Now, new random creates a v4 UUID for those of you that are interested. Then we're going to create a model.user that serves as a mock response from the user service. For now, we are not going to use all of the properties. Those aren't necessary for this test. So we're going to create a UID with this random ID we created, and then just an email and name. Next, we're going to instantiate a mock user service from mox.mockUserService, which we just created. Now, this is where Testify comes into play. We're going to say, okay, when we call the get method on the mock user service, so this is the syntax that the Testify package uses, so mockUserService.on get method, and if the parameters passed to the get method are of mock anything of type gin.context, so this is saying pass any sort of gin context, I don't care what's in it. If that's the first parameter and the second parameter is the UID we just defined, then return this mock user response and nil. So this is a successful case or a successful call to the user service. Then we're going to create something called an HTTP recorder, and this is from the HTTP test package provided by Golang, and so you should see that here. Next, we're going to create a gin router so that we can just serve HTTP like we would in a normal application. We can do this quickly and conveniently in Go, and that's beautiful. The next set of code here, router.use, is actually a middleware that we're using to create a mock user. Remember that I said we'll actually extract the user inside of an authorization middleware later. Well, we don't have that middleware inside of this unit. Remember, we're just trying to test this handler by itself. Therefore, in the test, we're going to set on the user context a model.user with UID of UID. And again, this is matching the UIDs we've used up above. Finally, we'll instantiate the handler with the new handler method, and that's inside of the handler file here. So now that we have a handler configured for our me route, we're actually going to create an HTTP request to send to that endpoint. And we can do that with the HTTP package's new request method. We say what type of method we're sending, the API endpoint, and then any sort of body. So in this case, we don't need a body. We're just going to extract the user from that middleware I mentioned. So we assert that there's no error, and then we actually just take the GIN router defined above and serve HTTP on it with the request that we just defined, and then we'll write the response to this test writer, which was right here. So next, I'm going to create the expected response that we get from calling this me handler. Now remember, the me handler returns a key called user, then the actual user response on that key. Then I'm going to use the JSON.Marshal method, which returns a slice of bytes. So this will actually match the actual JSON response, which is a serialized version of that JSON. So we do that here to set, again, this is the expected response. And then we're going to just assert that we get a status OK of 200, which maybe I should write http.statusOK here. I'll update that later. And then we're also going to assert that the response body here is equal to the response reader.body.byte. So this is what's actually returned from the request up here. Remember, we're serving HTTP with the request and writing the response to RR. So we say rr.body.bytes, that returns a slice of bytes. Response body here is a slice of bytes. And the last thing that we do is we check our mock user service, and we check by saying assert expectations, we check that it was basically called one time. And there's easier ways and different syntaxes to do that if you look into the Testify package. Next, we test the case when there is no user on the context. So again, we have to define a mock user service, and we say that when we call get with any two parameters for the context and user ID to return nil and nil. And in this case, really, it doesn't matter too much because we're not going to create a user on the request. So here you see that we set up the router with gin.default, but remember that up here we had to create this sort of middleware to append a user to the request context. So in this case, we should run the request, and that user doesn't exist error should be returned before the user service is even called. The only reason I'm adding this here is to set the expectation to make sure that the mock user service never gets called. All right, so again, we create a new handler, and then we create a request to the same endpoint, and we serve the request, and then we make sure that we get a 500 internal error and that the mock user service is not called. The final test case we'll run is for when the user is not found or the user service returns an error. So again, we do a lot of the same setup as we did before, but this time on the mock user service, we say when we call the get method with any context parameter and the UID defined here, we actually want to return nil for the user and an error response with any message. And here I'm just saying any error down the call chain, which could be in the service or the repository layer. We do a lot of the same setup before, and this time we want to make sure we do have a user on the middleware. We serve HTTP, and then we set an expected response error with a new not found. And then we just assert that our actual response is that response error, and that our response error.status, which in this case should be a 404, is the same as the actual response. And finally, we want to make sure our mock user service was called again in this case, and that it is that mock user service call that returns the error. So what do you know? I almost concluded this video without doing the most important part, which is to run the tests. So to test a particular package, we can run go test. I'll use the -v, which is a verbose flag, meaning to give more details or more output. And then we'll use the relative path to the handler package. So we can see here that our test me passed and that each of the three cases also passed. Let's say that we want to make it fail, so let's maybe go to this first one. Instead of status OK, let's say it's http.status internal server error maybe. And then let's run the test again just to make sure it fails. And as you see, that single test case for success failed. And I encourage you to try some other things, make these tests fail. Maybe you'll find something I did wrong. Please send it to me if you do, and I'll update it. Alright, I know I may have struggled a little to explain these tests, but I think the information I learned while preparing this was very useful, and I hope that some of you have also found the content useful. If you have found this content useful, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to this channel. Next time, we'll work on creating the actual implementation of the user services get method. So until next time, ciao, hasta luego.